And we provide clinical and support services for young people, education and training, and we see about 280,000 young people each year. Most of them in adolescence and up to the age of 25, but most of them within the teenage years. And obviously, what we see is a vast majority of young people whose experiences of relationships and of sex will be within the spectrum of normal, healthy sexual development. Sometimes things which make you worry a little bit around the edges in relation to what they understand around consent and to how they're managing their relationships, but most will make their way through adolescence fairly well. But we do also see those who've been hurt and abused by the very adults that should be there to protect them. And of course our task of eradicating abuse, violence and exploitation has to be one of the most significant worldwide challenges and one of the issues also within the UK which has to be increasingly at the top of the agenda. My task today is twofold. I'm talking now about healthy relationships, and then I'm going to summarise at the end of the day, which may seem a little bit peculiar, and it may be a bit peculiar, who knows, we'll work that out at the end of the day. But what the reason for it is really to, as somebody that sits and works across all young people, to listen to what's been said today and to think about eradicating child sexual abuse in the context of developing positive, healthy relationships and positive sexual health outcomes for young people. And it seems to us, as we work with organisations like Lucy Faithful, like the NSPCC, that too often people don't know enough about what healthy sexual development is, and as much as they don't often understand or recognise the signs of abuse and harm. And so all of us have to find ways of working together to ensure that right from the outset we have the opportunity to help children and young people understand what healthy relationships are so that they can recognise what they can do to make them go well and when things are going wrong and they need to get help. But also, of course, for parents and professionals as well. And all of you know that very, very well, but we all, of course, have different day jobs, and our task is to try and find ways to work across sectors, across organisations, to ensure that we get that spectrum right. So Brook opened its doors 50 years ago next week, and our mission is to enable young people to enjoy their sexuality without harm. And I think it's worth just saying, as I have, that also young people want to be moral agents in their sexual lives. What we often find from young people is that nobody has a sensible conversation with them about sex because they're too busy believing that they want to access porn on the internet, that they want to be having sex all the time, that all they want to do is get drunk and be having sex. And so what we have, if we're really going to eradicate sexual abuse, is to change our whole attitude and culture towards both sex and abuse and children and young people. And if you put all of those things together, that is actually a massive culture change which we've got to try and achieve, but one which has to be possible, has to be affordable, and is something that we have a moral duty to do. So, in terms of the key things that are common for those children and young people that we see who've experienced the abuse, and those children and young people who manage their lives fairly well into adolescence, is that too often they tell us that parents and professionals don't feel comfortable talking about bodies, sex or relationships. So children leaving primary school, not knowing that they've got a vagina, not knowing that they've got a penis, girls never knowing that they have a clitoris, girls never knowing that they have a right to the playground in the same way that boys do. All these things which are part of our cultural attitudes and cultural norms which allow sexual abuse to be perpetuated are things that we have to challenge. We have a new Secretary of State for Education today, whose view on personal social health education we don't yet know, but we will probably have a task to convince them that this is something that we need to be putting right at the heart of the school curriculum. If we don't, we continue to allow those cultures, those norms, that ignorance to be perpetuated, and that embarrassment, that feeling of shame which so many people in the generations 30, 40, 50 years ago continue to experience in 2015, which is not something that I want to be a part of. That when it comes to the campaign to try and get schools to do more, when it comes to educating parents, what we have is parents who think that schools are doing it, and schools that think that parents don't want them to do it. And part of the reason for that, of course, is because we've got the politicisation around talking about sex with children. But if you look over the last 10 years, there is hope. The headline now screams out, 4-year-olds to be taught about sex. But then the actual columns that follow, the piece that follows, is generally much more sensible. But when you actually talk to parents, when you talk to a lot of professionals, they believe that schools are doing much more than they actually are. And all that schools have to do at the moment is do a little bit about biology. And so what children say, too little, too late, too biological. If we're really going to eradicate sexual abuse, then we've clearly got to change that. They want us to deal with more emotions, more relationships, more real-life dilemmas. They also tell us that asking for help can be difficult, that we don't reward asking for help, and that's particularly true when it comes to boys and young men. So you end up with people who wait until it's too late to ask for help, to wait until they've been hurt for a long time to ask for help. And a huge amount is being done about that. But again, our cultural norm of not listening to children and young people, believing that you have to have the stiff upper lip, doesn't help when it comes to actually enabling children to get the help and support they need. So too often children and young people feel embarrassed about their bodies, don't have the names for it, and that don't understand what abuse is, don't understand what healthy relationships are. As you get into the later years, you also see young people who are about 13, 14, 15 who don't know and understand what consent is, don't know and understand what consent should look like. So when you've got an age group that are also having peer violence, and I know Sue Berlovitz spoke this morning, and yes, adults are a major part of abuse, but we increasingly know and understand about peer abuse, so we do have to put consent front and centre of everything we do. And it seems to me that one of the other things we have to do is recognise that the internet is just a route to harm being done, it's not the cause of harm. That too often we seem to get distracted by all these things that the internet is causing, rather than the internet being another route through which children can be hurt and abused. So it seems to me if we're going to eradicate sexual abuse, we have to have a culture change, and that culture change is about seeking help, it's about understanding what healthy relationships are, it's about trusting children and young people, and it's about helping them to understand that they must be able to ask for help and advice if they need it. We need professionals to know and understand about healthy sexual development, and to know what isn't healthy as well. And of course that goes for children and young people too, and things like the NSPCC Underpants campaign are core to helping children and young people. But we mustn't just continue to tell children when things are bad. We must also help them to know when things are good and what they can do to try and encourage that as well. We've got to stop tiptoeing around parents and saying that they feel embarrassed and ashamed, and stop making this out to be a really big deal. In the same way that we have to teach about food, in the same way that we have to teach about putting your clothes on, we also have to teach about the fact that we have body parts and that we have to keep ourselves safe, and that adults and others shouldn't hurt you. And I think too often we say this is difficult. We make it difficult instead of saying this is just another thing that you have to teach, another thing that you have to do. And I think that goes across professions as well. And yes, we may find it hard. That doesn't mean it's sensitive. That doesn't mean it's difficult. It means it's something that we just have to find a way of doing. We have to make sure that PSHE is statutory in schools. And we really do need all of you, whether you're working in the police, whether you're working in mental health services, whether you're working in children's services, to get behind this agenda, because if we don't get it statutory in schools, then we continue to have a cheap universal provision for children and young people, which will lay the foundations for that specialist work as well. And finally, we must listen and trust children and young people and find real active ways to make sure that they know that we listen and trust them, because too often they believe that we don't.